In the late 1950s, the post-war electronics boom pushed human engineering to a severe physical threshold. The invention of the transistor had promised a future of compact, highly efficient machines, freeing engineers from bulky vacuum tubes. Across the United States, laboratories raced to design guidance systems and data processors. Yet, as the ambition of these designs expanded, the physical reality of assembling them became a logistical nightmare. Every single component had to be manually connected. This manual assembly required armies of technicians wielding soldering irons to join thousands of discrete components with intricate tangles of wire. As engineers attempted to build advanced systems requiring tens of thousands of parts, the sheer volume of necessary physical connections became a bottleneck. The industry dubbed this looming crisis the tyranny of numbers. It was a spatial dead end where the theoretical capabilities of electronics were held hostage by the limits of human hands. The technical paradox of the era deeply frustrated the brightest minds in electrical engineering. The transistor itself was a marvel of solid-state physics, capable of switching electrical signals with unprecedented reliability and minimal power consumption. But a transistor could not function in isolation. It had to be integrated into a broader circuit. Every time a new component was added to increase computational power, it required at least two new manually soldered joints. This exponential increase in physical connections created a catastrophic reliability curve. In a complex aerospace system containing 100,000 soldered joints, even a low failure rate meant the entire machine was practically guaranteed to fail upon activation. The joints were vulnerable to thermal expansion, vibration, and human error. The very act of making a machine smarter inherently made it more fragile, creating a hard ceiling on the advancement of modern computing. Breaking through this physical ceiling required a fundamental reimagining of how electronic systems were conceived. The solution would not emerge from a unified national project, but rather from a parallel race between two distinct corporate arenas separated by half a continent and entirely different engineering cultures. In Dallas, Texas, a rapidly expanding defense contractor was aggressively hunting for a miniaturization breakthrough to secure military contracts. Simultaneously, out on the West Coast, a different ecosystem was taking root in the Santa Clara Valley, a region that would eventually become known as Silicon Valley. Here, Fairchild Semiconductor was pushing the boundaries of solid-state physics under the leadership of unconventional scientists like Robert Noyce. These two companies, operating in total isolation from one another, were about to attack the tyranny of numbers from entirely different angles. Inside the sprawling Dallas laboratories of Texas Instruments, in the spring of 1958, the atmosphere was one of intense urgency. The company was heavily invested in a United States Army Signal Corps initiative known as the Micro-Module Program. This defense project sought to solve the wiring crisis by standardizing the size and shape of discrete components, snapping them together to eliminate cumbersome wires. The engineering floors at Texas Instruments were dominated by this modular approach, with teams meticulously designing standardized ceramic wafers that could be stacked into compact cubes. It was a highly disciplined corporate environment driven by immediate military deliverables. The prevailing wisdom within the building was that miniaturization was a packaging problem, a puzzle of mechanical engineering rather than a question of fundamental materials science. Into this rigid environment stepped a quiet engineer named Jack Kilby, hired by Texas Instruments in May of 1958. Kilby did not possess a doctorate or a prestigious academic pedigree. His background was in designing ceramic-based silkscreen circuits. However, he possessed an intuitive understanding of component integration and a pragmatic approach to solving complex electrical problems. Upon his arrival, Jack Kilby was immediately assigned to work on the Micro-Module program. Given his lack of seniority, he had little leeway to challenge the core premise of the project. Yet, as he analyzed the military's proposed solution, Kilby quickly realized that standardizing the shape of discrete parts did not actually solve the fundamental issue of soldered connections. It merely reorganized the problem into a slightly smaller box. The trajectory of modern electronics was irrevocably altered by a simple quirk of corporate human resources policy. In July of 1958, Texas Instruments initiated its annual mass vacation, a period when nearly the entire workforce abandoned the sweltering Dallas campus for a 2-week reprieve. Because Kilby had only been employed for 2 months, he had not accrued vacation time, leaving him stranded in the eerily quiet laboratory facilities. This isolation provided an unexpected sanctuary from the daily pressures of the micromodule program. Without meetings to attend or the constant hum of a crowded engineering floor, Kilby was granted the rarest of commodities in the corporate world. He had uninterrupted time to think deeply about the underlying physics of the problem. Sitting alone at his bench, surrounded by idle testing equipment, he began to sketch out a radical alternative. The conceptual leap Kilby made during those quiet weeks became known as the monolithic idea. He recognized that the only way to truly eliminate the wiring bottleneck was to eliminate discrete components entirely. Because the company already manufactured semiconductors, Kilby reasoned that if a transistor could be carved from a piece of silicon or germanium, then passive components like resistors and capacitors could also be fashioned from that exact same material. Instead of wiring separate materials together, the entire circuit could be integrated into a single, continuous block of semiconductor. By altering the chemical doping of specific regions on a single chip, different areas of the material could be engineered to perform different electrical functions. The integrated circuit would no longer be a collection of assembled parts. It would be a single, unified physical object. When management returned from vacation, Kilby presented his sketches and was granted permission to build a working prototype. In late summer, he took a tiny sliver of germanium and began transforming the monolithic idea into physical reality. Using rudimentary lab tools, he etched a phase shift oscillator circuit directly onto the semiconductor material, carving distinct regions to act as a transistor, a capacitor, and several resistors. Because the technology to connect these integrated regions internally did not yet exist, Kilby had to manually wire the distinct areas of the germanium sliver together. He suspended microscopic gold wires, referred to as flying wires, above the surface of the chip, soldering them down to complete the electrical pathways. The resulting device was crude, resembling a jagged sliver of glass trapped in a chaotic spiderweb of gold threading, but it represented the first true integrated circuit. The ultimate validation of this solitary summer labor occurred on September 12, 1958. Kilby gathered a group of skeptical Texas Instruments executives around his workbench to witness the demonstration. He connected his crude flying wire germanium prototype to an oscilloscope, a device used to visually display electrical signal frequencies on a glowing screen. With the flick of a switch, voltage flowed through the tiny, unified block of semiconductor material. Instantly, a perfect sine wave materialized on the oscilloscope, proving beyond any doubt that the oscillator was functioning precisely as designed. In that quiet laboratory moment, the tyranny of numbers was fundamentally broken, and the modern microchip was born, proving that complex electronic systems could indeed be manufactured as a single, monolithic entity. As Jack Kilby celebrated his quiet victory in Dallas, a parallel thread of discovery was already unwinding on the opposite side of the country. The monolithic idea had been proven in principle, but the flying wires of the germanium prototype made it fragile and difficult to scale. Thousands of miles away, another brilliant mind was wrestling with the exact same tyranny of numbers, completely unaware of the breakthrough that had just occurred at Texas Instruments. This parallel timeline unfolded in the sun-baked orchards of Northern California, an area just beginning to hum with technological ambition. Here, the focus was not merely on proving that a unified circuit could work in a laboratory, but on designing one that could be manufactured at a massive commercial scale. The race to shrink electronics was shifting from a solitary inventor's workbench to a bustling corporate ecosystem. Fairchild Semiconductor operated with a kinetic energy that stood in stark contrast to the formal hierarchies of older Eastern electronics firms. Founded by brilliant defectors from William Shockley's laboratory, the company was characterized by intense intellectual debates and a fierce drive to push the boundaries of solid-state physics. The sprawling facilities were filled with engineers working amid the distinct smells of etching acids and the hum of high-temperature furnaces. This frenetic environment laid the cultural foundation for what the world would eventually come to know as Silicon Valley. Fairchild was a crucible of innovation where failure was viewed as data and risk-taking was heavily incentivized. Within these walls, a unique blend of scientific rigor and entrepreneurial spirit created the perfect conditions for a second independent leap in microelectronics. At the center of this vibrant ecosystem was Robert Noyce, a charismatic physicist with a profound understanding of semiconductor mechanics and manufacturing logistics. In late 1958, Noyce began reviewing a novel technique developed by his colleague Gene Herney, known as the planar process. Herney had figured out how to protect the delicate junctions of a silicon transistor by leaving a flat, insulating layer of silicon dioxide over the wafer. Noyce stared at the diagrams of this flat, protected silicon surface and saw something beyond a mere protective coating. He realized that the oxide layer formed a perfect, non-conductive canvas, resting directly above the active electronic components embedded below. By carefully etching microscopic holes through this oxide layer, engineers could expose only the specific connection points of the transistors and resistors that needed to be linked together. The true elegance of Noyce's vision crystallized in early 1959 when he conceptualized a way to eliminate the need for manual wiring. Instead of suspending fragile gold threads above the chip, Noyce proposed depositing a thin layer of metal directly onto the flat oxide canvas. This metal could then be chemically etched away to leave behind incredibly fine pathways that connected the components through the pre-drilled holes. These printed interconnects fundamentally changed the architecture of the integrated circuit. The silicon dioxide acted as an impermeable barrier, preventing the metal pathways from short-circuiting against the underlying semiconductor material. The entire circuit became a single, flat, solid-state block, without protruding parts, moving the concept from a three-dimensional mechanical assembly to a two-dimensional chemical printing process. This transition from flying wires to printed metallic lines represented a massive leap in manufacturability. Because the interconnects were deposited and etched using photographic masks and chemical baths, hundreds of identical circuits could theoretically be produced on a single wafer of silicon simultaneously. The painstaking process of hand soldering microscopic wires was completely bypassed. As a result, the integrated circuit transformed from a bespoke laboratory curiosity into a highly scalable commercial product. Noyce's planar approach meant that complex electronics could be churned out with the same repetitive consistency as printing a newspaper. The barrier to mass production had been shattered, setting the stage for an exponential explosion in computing power. Yet, the realization of this immense commercial potential instantly triggered a deeply adversarial phase in the development of the microchip. The technical hurdles had been cleared, but the question of ownership remained unresolved, pulling the focus out of the pristine laboratories and into the complex machinery of corporate law. The battleground shifted from silicon wafers to legal filings. By the spring of 1959, the realization that billions of dollars in future licensing fees were at stake mobilized executives at both companies. The race to secure intellectual property rights over the integrated circuit became a sprint, with lawyers scrambling to translate solid-state physics into airtight legal claims. The collision course between Dallas and Northern California was officially set. Texas Instruments struck first, moving aggressively to stake their claim. On February 6, 1959, the company formally filed a patent application for Jack Kilby's invention, meticulously describing his method of integrating electronic components into a single body of semiconductor material. The documentation highlighted the genius of his summer breakthrough, even if the physical prototype still relied on cumbersome hand wiring. A month later, Texas Instruments held a highly publicized press conference in New York City to announce their triumph. They unveiled what they called the solid circuit, proudly displaying a microscopic device that packed the equivalent of several traditional components into a space smaller than a match head. Executives touted the invention as the ultimate solution to the industry's size limitations. Despite the confident presentation, the broader electronics industry reacted to the announcement with intense skepticism. Engineers from rival firms openly doubted that manufacturing such a device could ever be economically viable. The prevailing wisdom suggested that because a single defective component would ruin the entire chip, the overall yield of usable circuits would be dismally low, making them prohibitively expensive. Trade journals in the spring of 1959 were filled with editorials questioning the practicality of throwing away an entire integrated circuit just because one microscopic transistor failed. The industry was deeply entrenched in the paradigm of discrete components, where individual parts could be tested before assembly. To many seasoned engineers, the solid circuit seemed like a brilliant but impractical stunt. While the industry debated the merits of the Dallas invention, Fairchild Semiconductor quietly prepared their legal counterstrike. In July 1959, Robert Noyce formally filed his own patent application for a semiconductor device and lead structure. His documentation heavily emphasized the crucial addition of the planar process and the flat, adherent metal interconnects. Fairchild's legal strategy was highly calculated, focusing on the glaring weakness of the Texas Instruments design. By detailing how the printed metal lines completely eliminated the need for manual wiring, the Fairchild filing presented a device inherently designed for mass production. This specific emphasis on the printed interconnect structure laid the groundwork for a legal argument that Noyce had invented the first truly practical version of the technology. The technical contrast between the two patent filings highlighted the distinct nature of their parallel breakthroughs. Jack Kilby's claim rested on the profound conceptual leap of the monolithic idea, demonstrating that an entire circuit could exist within a single block of germanium. His documentation proved the fundamental physics of integration, showing that resistors, capacitors, and transistors could be coaxed out of one continuous piece of semiconductor material. Conversely, the filing submitted by Robert Noyce to the United States Patent Office in 1959 claimed the crucial planar interconnect system. By utilizing silicon and layering flat, adherent metal leads over an insulating layer of silicon dioxide, Noyce solved the exact manufacturing hurdle that plagued earlier designs. His system provided the blueprint for automated mass production, elegantly sidestepping the physical limitations of hand-wired connections. The collision of these two foundational filings forced an immediate bureaucratic reckoning, because both inventors essentially claimed the underlying architecture of the integrated circuit. The United States Patent Office could not simply grant parallel monopolies. The underlying technical claims were too closely intertwined, creating an unprecedented legal bottleneck that threatened to freeze the development of the technology. In response to this overlap, patent examiners officially declared a state of interference, a formal administrative ruling indicating that the claims were in direct conflict. This declaration marked the official beginning of a grueling, decade-long legal battle over the true authorship of the microchip. What began as a race of isolated scientific discovery instantly transformed into a high-stakes war of intellectual property attrition. The arena of innovation abruptly shifted from the quiet intensity of the laboratory to the sterile, adversarial environment of corporate conference rooms. The thrilling uncertainty of scientific experimentation was replaced by the exhaustive tedium of legal discovery, moving to windowless offices filled with towering stacks of documentation. The raw energy of invention was suddenly suffocated by the rigid formalities of corporate litigation. Armies of corporate attorneys representing Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor descended upon the historical record, turning every piece of paper into a potential weapon. They meticulously dissected years of lab notebooks, searching for any ambiguity in dates, hastily drawn sketches, or vague technical definitions that could invalidate the opposing side's claim. The daily reality became an endless cycle of depositions and defensive posturing. In the ensuing legal proceedings, the arguments frequently hinged on microscopic semantic distinctions. Lawyers for Texas Instruments argued forcefully that Kilby's original 1958 prototype definitively proved the monolithic concept first. They maintained that the sheer existence of a working circuit on a single substrate satisfied the legal requirement for invention, regardless of how the internal connections were physically made. Fairchild's legal team countered by relentlessly attacking the physical structure of that very prototype. They argued that Kilby's reliance on hand-soldered flying wires meant he had not actually invented a fully integrated circuit, because the wires themselves were separate components. They insisted that only Noyce's adherent leads met the strict definition of a completely unified, manufacturable device. For the innovators caught in the center of this storm, the protracted litigation felt like a suffocating and deeply personal distraction. Jack Kilby, a pragmatic engineer who thrived on the quiet satisfaction of solving tangible problems at the workbench, found the endless legal posturing profoundly frustrating. He wanted to build the next iteration of his device, not spend his days defending the first one. Robert Noyce shared this profound weariness, feeling equally trapped by the bureaucratic machinery of the patent system. Both men were forward-looking visionaries who preferred driving the future of electronics to sitting in depositions, arguing over the exact wording of past achievements. It was a bitter irony that their brilliant engineering work was now ammunition in a stagnant legal quagmire. Yet, while the lawyers remained locked in a seemingly endless stalemate over intellectual property rights, the outside world refused to wait for a definitive verdict. The electronics industry was evolving at a blistering pace, driven by an insatiable demand for smaller, faster, and more reliable components. The abstract legal debate over who owned the past was rapidly overshadowed by the urgent necessity of building the future. The market reality began to vastly outpace the slow, deliberate grind of the court system. Defense contractors, aerospace engineers, and computer manufacturers did not care who held the ultimate patent. They only cared that the technology existed and that they needed millions of these devices immediately. This overwhelming commercial pressure created a powerful undercurrent that threatened to sweep past the warring corporations. Recognizing this explosive market pressure, executives at both Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor began to analyze the financial geometry of their prolonged standoff. They realized that spending years fighting for an absolute monopoly was actually suppressing the growth of the very market they sought to dominate. The legal uncertainty was causing potential customers to hesitate, delaying widespread adoption and hurting both companies' bottom lines. The business logic of cross-licensing emerged as the only rational path forward. By agreeing to share the foundational patents, both companies could collect lucrative royalties from the rest of the industry, transforming a bitter legal dispute into a mutually beneficial alliance. This pragmatic strategy acknowledged that a shared piece of a massive global market was far more valuable than total ownership. This pragmatic realization culminated in a landmark corporate treaty that would reshape the entire technology landscape. In the summer of 1966, after years of grueling litigation, executives from both technology giants formally executed a comprehensive cross-licensing agreement. The paperwork was drafted to ensure that neither side had to admit defeat, but rather that both would profit from the combined genius of their respective inventors. Under the strict terms of this settlement, Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor agreed to legally share the rights to the integrated circuit. More importantly, they established a standardized framework to license the combined technologies to outside manufacturers for a set royalty fee. This administrative maneuver effectively ended the corporate war that had threatened to strangle the semiconductor industry in its infancy. The execution of the 1966 agreement instantly removed the heavy legal cloud hanging over the global technology sector. Companies across the globe that had hesitated to adopt the new architecture for fear of devastating patent infringement lawsuits were suddenly given a clear, legally protected pathway to proceed. The removal of this barrier acted as a catalyst, triggering a massive influx of capital into the field. This legal truce unlocked the mass market for microchips, unleashing a wave of confident investment in highly advanced semiconductor manufacturing facilities. The resolution cleared the way for the explosive economic growth of what would soon become known as Silicon Valley, ensuring that the parallel breakthroughs of two isolated engineers would escape the courtroom and permanently rewire the infrastructure of the modern world. In the mid-1960s, the commercial market remained deeply wary of the high price tag attached to the integrated circuit. However, the geopolitical pressures of the Cold War and the space race created an environment where performance outweighed cost. Inside government contractor facilities, aerospace engineers faced severe physical constraints. The Apollo space program needed a lightweight guidance computer for lunar navigation, and the United States Air Force required miniaturized, ultra-reliable electronics for its Minuteman II missiles. The federal government became the crucial first customer for this unproven technology. During 1962, the Apollo program alone consumed over 1 million microchips, essentially buying up the entire early production run. The sterile, high-security assembly rooms of aerospace contractors transformed into the proving grounds for these silicon devices, shielding manufacturers from the immediate financial pressures of the consumer market. This massive, guaranteed government demand altered the economics of semiconductor manufacturing. Initial fabrication of complex devices carries a prohibitive unit cost due to high failure rates. However, the sheer volume of military and aerospace orders allowed Fairchild Semiconductor and Texas Instruments to continuously iterate on their production lines, improving their chemical etching techniques without facing financial ruin. As factory yields improved, meaning a higher percentage of usable chips were successfully extracted from each silicon wafer, the unit price plummeted. A single integrated circuit that cost $50 in 1962 dropped to under $3 by 1968. This drastic cost reduction was the mechanical lever that finally made the technology viable for civilian use, proving that mass manufacturing microscopic components was a scalable industrial reality. With prices falling rapidly, the technology began its swift migration from government silos into the broader commercial sphere. Engineers across various industries started integrating these newly affordable chips into everyday products. Zenith introduced one of the first consumer applications in 1964 by placing an integrated circuit inside a hearing aid, capitalizing on the chip's microscopic footprint and low power consumption. The transition quickly accelerated from small wearables to massive enterprise machines. Mainframe computer manufacturers, previously constrained by the physical bulk and massive heat generation of individual transistors, began redesigning entire systems around the microchip. By the late 1960s, the technology was moving rapidly toward general consumer electronics, laying the structural groundwork for desktop calculators and digital watches. This rapid commercial adoption ignited an explosive financial expansion across the semiconductor industry. The integrated circuit was no longer viewed merely as a specialized aerospace component, but as the foundational building block for all modern electronics. Revenue for chip manufacturers skyrocketed, transforming a niche scientific endeavor into a multi-billion-dollar global sector within a single decade. The macro-level impact of this commercialization reorganized the global economy. Traditional mechanical and vacuum tube industries were rendered obsolete almost overnight, replaced by a new technological paradigm defined by exponential increases in computing power and continuous miniaturization. The microchip became the invisible engine driving a new digital age, embedding computing capabilities into machines that previously relied entirely on gears and raw electricity. As the industry they birthed expanded into a global economic force, the personal trajectories of the two men who sparked the revolution began to diverge. The shared milestone of the integrated circuit had bonded them in history, yet their daily realities were shaped by vastly different corporate environments and personal ambitions. While the commercial market eagerly devoured their parallel inventions, Robert Noyce and Jack Kilby pivoted toward entirely different frontiers. One would channel his energy into building a corporate empire that would define a geographic region, while the other would retreat back to the laboratory to solve the immediate challenge of consumer demand. By 1968, Robert Noyce had grown deeply frustrated with the increasingly bureaucratic management at Fairchild Semiconductor. Seeking a return to an agile, engineering-focused culture, Noyce and his colleague Gordon Moore resigned to co-found a new venture they called Intel. They secured $2.5 million in funding almost instantly, based entirely on a one-page business plan and Noyce's formidable reputation. At Intel, Noyce doubled down on the future of silicon, directing the company's focus towards semiconductor memory and the microprocessor. He established a corporate structure that stripped away traditional hierarchies, replacing executive suites with open-plan cubicles to foster direct communication between management and engineers. This operational model prioritized rapid iteration and aggressive technological risk-taking over cautious corporate planning. Noyce's departure from Fairchild and the subsequent success of Intel catalyzed the geographical and cultural phenomenon that would soon become known as Silicon Valley. The dusty agricultural expanse of the Santa Clara Valley rapidly transformed into a dense, interconnected ecosystem of venture capital firms, specialized manufacturing facilities, and ambitious startups. The region became defined by a unique culture of fluid employment. This geographic concentration of talent and capital created an environment of relentless technological iteration. The landscape was dotted with low-slung corporate campuses and fabrication plants, all operating under the intense pressure of Moore's Law, the observation that computing power would double roughly every 2 years. Silicon Valley emerged as a self-sustaining engine of disruption built entirely upon the foundation of Noyce's planar process. 1,000 miles away in Dallas, Jack Kilby maintained his steady tenure at Texas Instruments, focusing his engineering prowess on a distinctly different challenge. Recognizing that the microchip needed a flagship consumer product to drive mass public adoption, Kilby assembled a small team in 1965 to build a miniature computing device to replace massive electromechanical desktop calculators. Over the next 2 years, Kilby and his team successfully engineered the first handheld electronic calculator, an invention internally dubbed the Caltech project. The working prototype utilized just 4 integrated circuits to perform basic arithmetic, outputting the results on a small strip of thermal paper. This invention directly demonstrated the everyday consumer utility of the microchip, proving complex mathematical processing could be carried in a pocket. While both men continued to push the boundaries of their respective fields, the lingering legal thread from their initial breakthrough finally reached its conclusion. In 1969, the United States Court of Customs and Patent Appeals issued its definitive ruling on the long-running patent interference case. The court ultimately favored the specific, highly manufacturable interconnect claims outlined in the patent filed by Robert Noyce. This final legal victory secured Noyce's technical claim to the modern, planar integrated circuit, effectively deciding the corporate battle over manufacturing rights. However, the historical consensus had already moved beyond the rigid confines of patent law. The scientific community, and eventually the broader public, recognized that the digital revolution required both leaps of genius, Kilby's conceptual proof that a monolithic circuit was possible, and Noyce's practical method for printing it onto silicon. Despite the millions spent by their respective employers fighting over patents, Jack Kilby and Robert Noyce refused to let corporate animosity poison their relationship. Whenever they appeared at industry conferences or accepted prestigious awards, each man publicly recognized the other's indispensable contribution. They understood what executives often forgot. Solving this monumental bottleneck required both the initial spark of the monolithic idea and the practical architecture to manufacture it. Their shared achievement stands as one of the clearest historical examples of multiple discovery. When a technological barrier becomes universally recognized, the immense intellectual pressure to solve it often produces simultaneous, overlapping solutions from isolated innovators. This dual origin fundamentally altered how intellectual property would be handled in electronics. By forcing Texas Instruments and Fairchild Semiconductor into a cross-licensing stalemate, the invention established an industry standard where competing firms license foundational technologies, accelerating hardware iteration rather than stifling it behind exclusive monopolies. The physical landscape of human existence was entirely rewritten by the invisible architecture they pioneered. Today, the integrated circuit operates silently within the walls of homes, the dashboards of vehicles, and the vast server farms that cool the Internet's data. For the modern worker, this means an environment saturated with automated logic, where microscopic transistors mediate every financial transaction and medical scan. The silicon chip erased the boundaries of geography, compressing entire libraries of human knowledge into slivers of material and reorganizing daily life around instant computation. The commercial aftershock of their breakthrough scaled at a velocity unprecedented in human history. By the year 2022, the global semiconductor market had expanded into a nearly $600 billion industry, serving as the critical foundation for the global economy. This staggering economic footprint shifted the geopolitical balance of power, turning microscopic manufacturing capabilities into matters of urgent national security. Governments began measuring their future sovereignty by their capacity to fabricate advanced logic chips, a direct consequence of the miniaturization race ignited in the late 1950s. Yet, looking back at the crucial pivot point of 1958 and 1959, the historical record leaves a subtle tension. It remains an open question whether the microchip revolution would have accelerated at the same blistering pace had only one of these men succeeded, if only the germanium prototype had been built, or if only the planar process had been theorized without a working model. The timeline of the digital age might have been delayed by a decade. The mystery lies in whether true innovation demands exactly this kind of concurrent, competitive pressure. Robert Noyce passed away in 1990, celebrated as the mayor of Silicon Valley. A decade later, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Jack Kilby, a moment of global recognition that cemented the quiet engineer's place in scientific history. In his Nobel lecture, Kilby characteristically deflected singular glory, acknowledging that the digital world was built by the collective labor of thousands. Their shared legacy is the enduring testament to human ingenuity, proving that physical limitations can be overcome by those willing to imagine something elegantly whole. The human aftermath of this story extends far beyond the laboratory, permanently altering the global workforce. The integrated circuit became the definitive invention of the modern era, transforming entire regions, such as the quiet agricultural expanses of the Santa Clara Valley, into sprawling megalopolises dedicated to semiconductor fabrication. Millions of engineers, assembly workers, and developers now earn their livelihoods within an ecosystem entirely dependent on the microchip. This single technological leap reorganized international trade routes and created a new class of industrial hubs, dictating where modern cities would rise and how the infrastructure of the future would be built. Yet beneath the staggering complexity of our interconnected planet, the physical foundation remains remarkably humble. It all traces back to those two isolated moments of clarity, a rough sliver of germanium bound by a few crude wires, and a flat wafer of silicon etched with microscopic pathways silently pulsing in the dark.